Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this Farmers Weekly webinar with the Woodland Trust, Trees, Climate Adaptation and Resilience within the farm business. Tonight, we'll be talking about integrating trees into farming systems and how that provides opportunities to help future-proof your farms against the impacts of climate change. We'll be hearing from two expert farmers, Abby Reader and Stephen Briggs, who are putting this into practice, and also a little bit from me as well, and also from Emily Hunter, Policy Advocate Land Use at the Woodland Trust. Just a bit of housekeeping. After the presentations, we'll open things up for discussion and put forward some of the advanced questions we've received, as well as hear about possible funding sources. Audience members can ask a question at any time. Just type them into the box at the foot of your screen, and then I will direct them to the panel. The webinar is expected to last for about an hour, and afterwards it will be available on demand, and you'll get an email to let you know when the recording is ready for viewing. Kicking things off a little bit from me, and I'll try and keep this brief so we can get to the real experts. But my name is Will Evans. I'm a farmer from Bangor-on-Dee, near Wrexham in North Wales. Wrexham, of course, the centre of the known universe at the moment. Ours is very much a family business. I'm in partnership with my wife and both my parents, and we are about 500 acres, mixed farm with 330 beef cattle, all bought in as dairy bred calves and taken right through to finishing. Highly productive lowland farm, two main blocks of land. The River Dee runs through the middle of the two. We're about 60 feet above sea level. So we grow about 340 acres of cereals and maize. We do a bit of contracting, bit of baling, and my wife also grows organic vegetables and sells them locally through a box scheme. And in my spare time, I also write a weekly column for Farmers Weekly. Apologies if you've read it. And I'm also the current chairman of the Oxford Farming Conference. So unlike the other speakers tonight, I'm not doing anything particularly interesting or different with trees. But I have, in recent years, become, much to my surprise, a bit of a hedge nerd and enthusiast. So growing up and in the early part of my farming career and life, I could not have been less interested in trees, biodiversity, or the natural world. And in fact, probably the only things I was interested in back then was tractors, cows, beer, girls, that kind of thing. But thankfully, I'm a bit more mature and environmentally aware these days. And it really started for me social media. Social media can be a terrible place for it. You can also learn a lot from there, from people. And I had a real, I guess, an epiphany moment, if that's not too dramatic, when I had an encounter on Twitter several years back now with an environmentalist called a guy called Simon Phelps. And what I'd done was I'd taken a picture of myself, made the mistake of taking a picture of myself hedge cutting. It was a sunny day. Red tractor, a Massey tractor, bright red, McConnell hedge cutter, bright yellow, lots of bright green, blue sky, and I thought, it's a great picture. There was a rainbow, brilliant. Put it on there for what could anyone object to? And of course, you know, people, this being social media, people do. And what he did was basically berated me on the state of the hedge. And he said it was ridiculously small, it was in very poor condition, and various sorts of things like that. Now, I've always been quite proud of our hedges. We've got a lot of hedges on our farm, and I didn't initially react very favourably. But after I reflected on his comments, they did make me start to look at things a little bit differently. And I started walking around the farm and thinking about previous hedge cutting practices and why I hadn't even noticed that, yes, this hedge could be bigger. Yes, there's a gap there. Yes, I could enhance that stretch. And I think a lot of farmers are perhaps the same in the everyday rush of things. You know, we all lead hectic lives. Don't need to tell any of you that, but sometimes we just don't notice these things or have time to think about it. So later, I invited Simon on the podcast I was doing at the time on rock and roll farming, and we had a really good discussion around the subject of farmers and environmentalists and why we often misunderstand each other. But it was very worthwhile as I got to point out some of the issues that we face as farmers around hedge management and maintenance, and some of the costs involved that he wasn't aware of, and I learned a lot from him about the benefits to nature that they provide. I think throughout the whole of society over the last few years, there's been that lack of willingness to listen to others' concerns, and it's very easy to casually dismiss things that we may not agree with. And we've often had sort of farmers over here environmentalists and NGOs over there, and in that situation, no one really wins, do we? So, but I cannot speak highly enough of the Woodland Trust and Coed Cadw here in Wales for the way they're working with farmers and supporting them, because I've planted a huge amount of hedges on our farm over the last few years, and they've been a joy to work with. There's not only do they provide the trees, advice and funding, and that all comes through their More Hedges scheme. There's also the more Wood scheme as well, all funded by Lloyds Bank, and I would encourage any of you to look at it, because it's super easy to apply for, and you get so much help as well. We've planted over, I think just over 2 kilometres of new hedge over the last 2 years, with thousands of mixed species trees, common and sessile oak, blackthorn, crabapple, dog rose, dogwood, field maple, hawthorn, hazel, holly. We've linked 2 small pieces of woodland together, just made this awesome wildlife corridor. We filled a lot of gaps this winter. We spent sort of filling quite a lot of gaps in existing hedgerows. Got the whole family involved, got my kids involved, and it's just been a really wonderful thing to do, actually, and knowing that those new hedges we've planted will be there long after any of us will be. And I think that's I don't know, it's just quite a cool thing to think about. Aside from the practical benefits to livestock, of course, good hedges, and I was reading the other day, they're unfortunately predicting a very hot summer again, so we've got to think about shade. We're quite exposed where this farm is. We get a lot of high winds coming down off the mountains to the west, so trying to think about that as well. The river, we get a lot of flooding. I've been thinking about soil erosion for a long time, trying to keep the soil in the fields. So hedges play an important part in that. And I also think on a sort of a slightly wider level, farmers are uniquely placed to try to mitigate and reverse the effects of climate change. We do have a responsibility to future generations to try our best to do that. And as like everybody else, I want to leave the farm and the planet in a better place for my children. And just sort of one last point is, and I do think this is quite important, I like many others in our farming community have struggled with stress and depression in the past, and it's well documented the problems we have as an industry with this. But this work I've done on the farm with planting new hedges with the family has been actually a really important thing for that. Just seeing it grow, feeling like I'm doing something positive for nature, the planet, fellow humans, has really made me feel good. And walking along that hedge now does really lift my spirits. I think that's quite important. Perhaps it's something we need to talk about more, the benefits of nature with these things. And last weekend I walked along it with the kids. We were looking at what's growing the best, what hasn't grown so much, and it's just a really sort of fun few hours. And it's also no coincidence, I think, when I do walk along that hedge, the last one we planted 2 years ago, that there's a lot of field mice running around, and then suddenly we've got barn owls back on the farm, which is an absolute joy. Last weekend as well, I got up pretty early one morning. I was outside early. The birds were all singing. We've got the 2 blocks of woodland that I mentioned that we've linked up with the hedge. They're only smaller, about 2 acres, and they're both almost right next to the farm. And the dawn chorus is pretty spectacular here, but it's because of those 2 blocks of woodland. And I never really thought about it before, but I was just thinking about if nobody had planted those 2 blocks of woodland 200 years ago, I wouldn't be sitting here now listening to all those birds. And it was just, I don't know, it was just, I hope that doesn't sound cheesy, but it was just something I've thought a lot about. So I'm excited to plant a lot more trees and hedges in the coming years. So that's enough for me. I'm going to hand over to the real experts now. So Abby, if you would like to take it away, please.
Well, thanks very much, Will, and thank you for introducing me as an expert farmer. I feel honoured, but I feel far from an expert in agroforestry. I mean, just as a bit of background, I farm just outside Cardiff in South Wales. We're a mixed farm, mainly dairy, but we also do beef, sheep and arable. We're about 700 acres. Of that, 2/3 is owned and 1/3 is rented. And that land that's rented is on a rolling either 1 year or 2 year FBT. So slightly sort of different setup. And the land that is owned, it's owned by my father and my uncle, and then I'm a partner in profit within the business. So Will has just painted this absolutely fantastic picture of the benefits that you can get from trying to get more trees onto your land. My picture is slightly different. So I haven't had an epiphany moment. And we do lots of things on our farms. We've got some lovely community orchards. We open up our ponds for people to come and have a look. We host a lot of visits. So there are a lot of things that we do on our farm that I'm very proud of and take absolute delight in seeing. When it comes to agroforestry, I would be one of its biggest critics, and I remain completely skeptical about the benefits of whether this is going to work or not. However, I am also completely open to giving it a go, because if it does work, then it can bring opportunities to my business that we don't have at the moment. We know that the eyes of the world are watching us as farmers to see what we can do to mitigate climate change. And I think you don't need to get hung up on whether you are committed to adapting to climate change or not. It's the fact that our customers want to see us do that. And also the opportunities that it could bring if you can integrate some of that into your farming system. So what is my agroforestry story? A bit like Will, I met someone on Twitter, which sounds really dodgy, but it's not. And I ran into a forester. His name is Richard Edwards, and he managed to convince me that if I put a small parcel of land aside to plant for a variety of different trees and a different crop, which I'll tell you about in a minute, then it could bring a different sort of income to the farm without committing too much land. So we were looking at doing, we selected a small area of land. It's just shy of 1.5 hectares, and then there's a bit of a perimeter around it. In terms of land selection, where are you going to put trees? Whenever I speak to people about agroforestry, the first thing I want to outline is my love is livestock. Livestock farming is everything for me. That's what I am trained in. I've got a degree in it, postgraduate degree. You can see the cow behind me, or bits of her anyway. Completely committed to that. So when it came to saying, oh, you need to give up a little bit of land now to plant trees, I was pretty unwilling to give anything that was going to be precious. So grazing ground was off the picture, because if cows needed to graze it, there's no way I was going to plant it. We obviously couldn't plant up our rented ground. And I wanted to make sure that we weren't going to be sacrificing any stylish fields. So we selected a field that was going to be on my father's portion of the farm. So succession is a big thing here. Remember, my farm is jointly owned. We had to look at where that was going to split. And believe you me, that was a very interesting conversation in itself. For any of you who are struggling with succession, I know your problems. But we managed to find a field, and then we picked a corner, and it's a real scrubby corner. It's something that we couldn't grow any arable on. There's a lot of stones there, bedrock very close to the surface. We selected that area to grow these trees. And we were looking at doing two things. So strips of about 2 meters running in parallel of short rotation coppice. So within there, we'd be growing willow, aspen, cherry, and lime. If you're like me and you are speaking Holstein Friesian or Shorthorn or Ayrshire, then willow, aspen, cherry, and lime are basically very quick growing trees. So you stick them in the ground, and in 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years, you are going to get a crop. Okay, so we're talking very quick growing. And the reason we went for those, they're native trees. This was going to be supported by the Woodland Trust, and it would be an opportunity. If you didn't go for native trees, you could get even quicker growing trees. Then between those strips, we were going to start planting a novel arable crop, about 6 meters wide, and this is called Cedar. This is a very high biomass, high protein crop. And I'm never going to be able to tell you all about this in 7 minutes. But the key thing is we're going to pack a lot of trees into a very small space. The Cedar, which is, it's not exactly a tree, but it's quite a woody, brushy plant that also can have this massive opportunity for carbon sequestration. It's got leaves a bit like a sycamore. It is very capable of sucking huge amounts of carbon out of the atmosphere, and it's got a fantastic root system. So it's going to get that carbon out of the atmosphere. Yes, it will build it into that biomass above ground, but actually the valuable bit for us as farmers is what is happening below the soil, because any carbon above ground is not guaranteed. You're going to burn it, feed it, whatever you're going to do. It's what's below ground that is going to count. And if we're thinking about carbon credits and opportunities for that, that is the bit that interests me. The short rotation coppice will be harvesting every 2 to 5 years, depending on which one it is and how successful it is. That will be turned into biochar, which is very similar to charcoal. And that could go into either sediments to go into compost to replace peat, which is very sustainable, or it could go into concrete, plaster. the building industry trade. The Cedar crop, very high protein crop, capable of competing soya if it works, and can grow on a farm like mine in Wales with pretty rainy climate, challenging conditions. So imagine if that works, the opportunities that it could bring to my farm. And the key thing being, again, it doesn't have to be a massive area on your farm. You could be a farmer that's maybe just farming 100 acres, and there is an opportunity here to just put a small parcel of land aside, and it can give you a diverse income, a different sort of crop. If you can displace soya, great, because that's really going to help your carbon credits. So there's lots of opportunities there. And thinking ahead as well for employment, I do recognize that actually it's quite a good way to introduce young people coming into the industry, maybe from outside of it. So there are a lot of opportunities here, and I'm really not going to be able to tell you a huge amount more in such a limited space of time, but I'll try and bring out some more information in the questions. But I think my parting message is I am a skeptic, but I am totally open to giving this a go. I think that the benefits that we can get if we try and put aside a lot of those bad feelings that we have towards trees, they've almost seemed to be weaponized. Forget that. If we can get an income, if we can make a profit, if we can make our businesses more resilient, that is absolutely what we need to do. And I can still keep cows at the same time. So huge benefit for me, and I will pass back to Will.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Abby. I've got loads of questions myself, and I might even ask you for those after. But Stephen, we'll go to you next.
Thanks, Will. I've got a few slides to try and visualize it as well, but just by way of introduction, I'm a first generation farmer over in Cambridgeshire. I run a farm business consultancy, Abacus, for the last 25 years. I'm a non-exec director of AHDB, and I did my Nuffield scholarship on agroforestry some 12 years ago now, so 13 years ago. Seems like yesterday. So a quick run through. Next slide, please. We've all got the challenges. We know climate change is with us, whether it's going to be really hot or really, really wet. We're, as farmers, we're professional gamblers. Next slide, please. And agroforestry, really, my epiphany moment that Will mentioned was moving to a rented farm and seeing the soils being quite degraded and blow away. And I looked at agroforestry sort of 18 years ago as a way of trying to mitigate some of the impacts of climate change and soil degradation. And it's not a new concept. Our agricultural policies in the CAB have shaped agriculture and largely removed trees and hedges to make land eligible for subsidies. And that position has now changed dramatically in the last few years. So agroforestry really is a mixture of perennials and annuals, where we're looking for ecological or economic interactions and designed in the right way to be sort of positive. Next, please. And the basis of my thinking really was that our major input to our farming systems, whether we're growing grass for cows or we're growing trees or indeed we've got solar panels, as an arable farmer as well, my major input is sunlight. Yet as an arable farmer, there are periods of the year when we turn the solar panels off. We're not actually harvesting photosynthetic activity. And if we can harvest more photosynthesis, we can get more input and therefore more productivity. Next, please. So as well as inputs like sunlight, agriculture is still a pretty leaky system. The reason we have a water framework directive and the water companies clean up nitrates out of our drinking water is that some of that leaches into watercourses, etc., and we lose it off the farm. And research that's been done has shown that by having some deeper rooting perennials in the system, they can capture some of that nitrate, stop it leaving the farm and turn it into a different kind of crop, but at least keep it on the farm so the investments we're making in fertilizers, etc., stay on the farm rather than going off farm. Next slide, please. So having them as the woody perennials or the trees as part of the landscape and trying to actually generate an income from them to have them to stop overland flow of sediments, of nutrients, etc., can play an important role. Next slide, please. The other light bulb moment for me really was this concept that actually not only do we not harvest all the photosynthesis, but all the nutrients and water are used by perennials and annuals in not only a spatial way, but also a temporal way. The crops tend to sort of use nutrients, sunlight, water early in the season, and if I look out the window today on the farm, the trees are only just starting to put leaf on and burst bud. So they're starting in April and May, and they'll go right on to the autumn. So there's a real temporal overlap in terms of when they use those resources. Next slide, please. In terms of spatial overlap, what we're trying to think about is that most annual crops will have quite shallow roots and be only growing maybe 6 inches to a couple of feet above ground. If we can layer our systems in a 3-dimensional way, we can actually make the farm bigger. My landlord charges me rent on a per acre basis, and I can make the farm bigger by going vertical, by going up and by going down. And as you can see from this slide, the tree roots in a forest plantation are very near the surface, because that's where all the nutrients and water are. Whereas in an agroforestry context, where you've got those two elements of annual plants and perennial plants, the rooting systems are quite different, and they tend to be much deeper in an agroforestry context. So it's about 3-dimensional farming. Next slide, please. So what we're trying to do here on the farm, and have done for the last 15 years, is address our soil and water quality issues, try and reduce the erosion, try and reduce wind speed, important for reducing evapotranspiration, especially during those summer months. But in the winter months, when we're wetter, try and improve that drainage and infiltration by stem flow with those deeper roots. And if we are subject to floods, help with that sort of mitigation of flood impact, and ultimately trying to modify the microclimate at a local level. Next slide, please. So how do we compare productivity and profitability if we're comparing a monocultural system and a sort of mixed tree crop landscape? Next slide. The easiest way to do that really is what's called a land equivalent ratio. And the research that's been done shows that if you have a hectare of agroforestry, you would need 0.8 hectares of agricultural land and 0.6 hectares of trees to get the same level of productivity, which gives you a land equivalent ratio of 1.4, means that you can get as much total output from 1 hectare as you would need for a large area of agriculture and trees growing separately. Next slide, please. And these land equivalent ratios at worst are about 1, i.e. it's about the same as having a monocultural system, and at best about 1.4, i.e. 40% more productive, but the majority are around 1.2, 1.3. And it's able to do this because you're harvesting more resources, sunlight, water, nutrients, for a longer period of time, and you've made the farm bigger by farming in a 3-dimensional way. But it's finding the way to do that in a way that's profitable. So a couple of slides by way of just showing what it looks like. Next slide, please. That can be a combination of cereals, or crops, or grass, or forage with biomass production, with fruit and nuts, with timber. There are a range of different options. Next slide. It can be integrating trees and livestock, whether that be a sort of more parkland type system, whether it's planting trees and grazing around those trees, or indeed it's actually opening up woodland and actually allowing some of those animals to have a herbage base in the base of that woodland, and providing that sort of shelter element for them, as well as there are opportunities for pigs and also for poultry as well. Next slide. So on our own farm in Cambridgeshire, I say we're predominantly tenanted. We planted 4,500 fruit trees on a 24-meter alley cropping system, growing 13 different varieties of fruit, primarily to stop some of the wind erosion, but also to benefit the farm in terms of increasing biodiversity, creating that sort of, I suppose, a turbocharged beetle bank across the landscape, and giving us another income stream as well. Next slide, please. So the trees were planted in 2008, and I say that we cover about 52 hectares across the land. We do a cereal harvest and then a fruit harvest subsequently. All we need is a knob of butter or a splash of milk from Abby's dairy cows, and we've got apple pie all in one field. What's not to like? And that's worked really well. In fact, what we're finding now is that actually when we get really wet periods in the winter and we get really dry periods in the summer, it's actually contributing to actually slightly better yielding crops right adjacent to the trees, because it's giving us some of that drainage and some of that wind protection in the summer and reducing evapotranspiration. So the crops benefit from that. And next slide, please. Ultimately, the other thing that we've done as well here is that, as this slide shows, that agriculture back in the 80s was getting about 11.5% of the value from the food chain. Now that's down to between 7 and 9%. So everybody else in the food chain above us makes the money, and as farmers we don't. So we're trying to capture as much value as possible through our farming system, and the trees, the fruit trees, albeit only occupying 4% of the farmed area, allow us to actually turn that into juice and actually capture more value rather than somebody else doing that in the supply chain. Next slide. So we've done that, and in parallel to planting the agroforestry, we opened a farm shop and are actually retailing our own juice, which actually captures more value rather than letting somebody else in the food chain do that. Next slide, please. So the Climate Change Committee and advising government have suggested that we need to move from 13% tree cover to 17%, and they've recommended that 2% of our farmed area should be as agroforestry. That's a target that we can move towards. So doing the kind of things that Abby's discussed and I'm discussing helps us towards that sort of target and bring some of those benefits with it. Next slide. Within at least within an England context, the Environmental Land Stewardship Programme, there will be a sustainable farming incentive agroforestry standard as of next year. That's in draft at the moment. Been helping with that, and that will help at least replace some of the losses through the basic payment scheme and fit along some of the countryside stewardship. Next slide. So some of the drivers, next slide, please, really are that we've got good data on agroforestry in terms of productivity, in terms of animal welfare. Next slide. We've got good information on biodiversity in terms of improving wildlife, plants, fungi, insects, birds, etc. Next slide. On our own farm, we know that we've got 200% more solitary bees and hoverflies, 240% more bumblebees, and a 10 times higher species richness on the agroforestry. Just yesterday, the guy came from Cambridge University doing our bird surveys and was sort of blown away by the number of birds in the agroforestry compared to even the open fields just next door. Next slide, please. And we've got largely good economic data around forestry models and around agroforestry models. But I think it's fair to say that we're still developing those economic models in terms of agroforestry as the number of farmers that are doing it actually sort of grows. So there's good information elsewhere in the world, but maybe not so much economic data here in the UK where we sit today. Next slide, please. So there are models around timber production, fruit or nut production, biomass, or even recreation and amenity. And as Abby has already mentioned, I think there's a massive opportunity around carbon as well and biodiversity. So next slide. The FAO have recognised that agroforestry is a land use model which can really contribute towards carbon and biodiversity. And we know we're sequestering about 4.5 tons of carbon per hectare with our own system that you've seen pictures on an annual basis. Next slide. And whether that's a slow growing species or a fast growing species, there's potential not only in above ground carbon in sort of timber, but also below ground from the root systems and building that soil carbon basis of between 1.5 and sort of 4 tons of carbon per hectare on an annual basis. So just to finish up then, really, if you go to the next slide, farmers, as Abby said, you don't need to plant the whole farm to trees, but if we took 20% of our land base and had some additional tree cover on there, some of the work that the Woodland Trust has done would suggest that if we had 5.8% more tree cover across our landscape, perhaps as an agroforestry type approach, we would completely meet the targets on climate change set under the Paris Accord. So we're not talking about complete reversion to woodland. It can be done in the same time as producing food, rearing animals, etc. Next slide. There are some challenges, some blockers, certainly around land tenure. And Abby's already mentioned succession and land tenure. We're a tenant. We've done it. It wasn't easy, but we've done it. Certainly the policies are coming on stream now in terms of agroforestry. There are some issues around tree health, about getting the planting material. Maybe there's some opportunities there to grow some nursery trees, so plant 2, sell 1 in a few years' time. That might be an opportunity for some. But I guess next slide. We know climate change is happening. We know we've got to adapt our farming systems, and perhaps that phrase, well, we've always done it this way. We need to really challenge and think about how we can get the best out of both models. Okay, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That was brilliant. I know every time I see you or speak to you, I threaten to come and visit you and see what you're doing. And that's just made me think I will even more. I might even bring a very skeptical my father with me if you can put up with that.
Always welcome.
Okay, before we start into the questions, I'm just going to ask Emily to introduce herself, please.
Yeah, sorry, just finding the mute button. Thanks, Abby and Stephen and Will. That was really interesting, actually, for me as well. So I'm Emily Hunter. I'm a policy advocate on land use at the Woodland Trust, and I lead all of our advocacy around, specifically elm development. So, but also I do a bit of work in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, sort of supporting my colleagues there, and they're what we call post-cap land use subsidies. So yeah, I'm sort of our expert on everything that's happening with elm, hopefully I'll be able to answer some of the questions today.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emily. All right, we'll kick straight off with questions. I've got a couple that were sent in beforehand, and I've got a very practical livestock farmer question here, which I'd be quite interested to hear about. And we'll direct this to Abby. It's from Philippa Padgett. Best protection from livestock for in-field trees.
Right, so my agroforestry site is a section of a field, and the protection that has got at the moment is a double electric fence, and that's it. I do wince a little bit sometimes when I look at it, but we do successfully graze. If we are grazing the silage ground on the other side, we do successfully graze heifers there. Protection in terms of anything else, actually the biggest threat to our trees at the moment is voles. They seem to enjoy tunneling underneath and eating the trees. We've also had a few issues with rabbits. So as much as we would have liked to put trees in without guards, it hasn't proved that successful.
Yeah, I tried planting a few hedge plants without plastic guards this time, just as a bit of an experiment, and the hares ate them all off very, very quickly. So yeah, I've had to put guards on them again. Okay, so a question for Emily. It was 2 questions actually. I'll ask you them both, Emily, because I think they're kind of covering similar kind of things. Can SFI, a question from Guy Kirkwood and from David Brotherton, can SFI more than make up the gap between the 75% that charities offer for the trees and protection and the 60% for labour, i.e. can I do the right thing for free? And similar vein, what income will I receive in year 1 and onwards to compensate me, not for growing wheat?
Okay, well, I'll try my best to answer them. I think the very simple answer is we don't know exactly what the SFI scheme is going to offer yet. So the SFI standard for agroforestry is due to be launched in 2024. And I think Stephen mentioned he's been working on some of that, and one of my colleagues at the Woodland Trust has been quite closely involved in developing that. We did have the DEFRA published a prospectus, as they called it, in January, and that had some indicative payment rates, and that mentioned paying £50 to £300 per hectare, depending on tree planting density, and also that you would be able to access some of the capital grants available through countryside stewardship. So we know that DEFRA are developing all of their schemes based on income foregone plus costs. So on that basis, you can kind of hope that they will develop payment rate, or expect that they're developing payment rates that would cover any income loss plus the costs. But obviously we won't know until we see further details of the scheme. In terms of whether it would make up the difference between what charities offer. So I know obviously the Woodland Trust has a few schemes. More trees and more hedges, we do pay 75% of the costs. Our Trees for Your Farm scheme that we've used to support a lot of farmers that have developed agroforestry, we pay 100% of the cost of the trees and protection, but the farmer provides the labour and the establishment and the management costs. But I would not expect that you would be able to combine the two. So you could apply to the Woodland Trust for one of our schemes, or you could apply to DEFRA for to go into the agroforestry scheme. They are keen on people being able to stack things, but DEFRA rules would say you can't receive their money for something you're being paid for elsewhere. So I think you could stack things. For example, you could sell the carbon at the same time as receiving a grant, but you couldn't get sort of Woodland Trust funding for agroforestry and DEFRA funding. But we'll have to wait to see sort of the final details when we see more details of the scheme, which I expect we'll probably see early 2024 at the latest.
Okay, thank you, Emily. So another practical farming question, really, and I'm again quite interested in this, and I'd imagine a lot of farmers would ask this question when you start talking about trees and agroforestry. It's a question from Jake Freestone: is there any conflict with trees and land drainage? And I guess, Stephen, you're the obvious man to ask this, farming in Cambridgeshire.
Yeah, well, thanks, Jake. It was the one question that my landlord or my landlord's agent asked to me when we wanted to put the system in, and actually it's really straightforward. It's about good drain management and maintenance, because clearly you wouldn't plant something like a willow, which is going to be quite invasive potentially on if you had an underdrain pipe drain system. So you have to be sensitive to the right tree in the right place. But in the winter, the trees are dormant. They're not looking for water. And that's when the drains are running. In the summer, the drains should be fairly empty. And that's when the tree, or the spring, summer, autumn, that's when the trees are looking for water. So if you've got broken drains or you've got blocked drains, it's only then, when the water is there in the summer, that the trees will go and try and exploit it. So really good drain maintenance, rodding, jetting, etc. In fact, I think now we have less. We're very low lying where we are with a very high water table, and we have more ponding in fields without the trees than we do in the fields with the trees. So 15 years on, it's not an issue for us. But we have selected quite small trees, and trees that we know aren't going to be a major issue, because we're drained everywhere.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Question for you, Abby, and it's from Richard C. I'm gonna shorten it down a little bit. It's quite a long question, but basically what he's asking is, how do we change mindsets around trees? So he's basically sort of saying, look, a lot of staff and contractors and some farmers react very badly when you talk about trees and farming. How do you change that mindset? I mean, I guess that's what we're trying to do tonight, but have you got anything to say to Richard?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and I sort of said it in the presentation, particularly from a Wales point of view. I feel that Welsh government has absolutely weaponised trees by making it such a topic of conversations. There's a requirement in Wales for 10% of your farmland to go under trees at the moment, under a proposal. It's not confirmed yet. So how do we join up those dots? Look, I'm a massive skeptic on this. I think that the only way we're going to do it is to prove that it will be economical and that it will drive an income. And that is why I've got this trial site, to see whether it will actually work. And it's having more conversations. I think the one thing that it has taught me is that we talk about farmers and foresters. Foresters are very practical, hands-on people. Farmers are very practical, hands-on people. We actually are coming from the same page. And it's trying to break down those barriers a bit more. Sorry, that's a bit of a loose question, but I totally get where you're coming from.
No, that's good. Thank you. Question for Emily, and again, I guess this would be a question you might get asked quite a lot at the Woodland Trust, because as in theory, we're all going to be planting a lot more trees, and there's going to be pressure on nurseries to provide them. So is there a risk of introducing diseases by sourcing trees from nurseries that import plant material from other countries in Europe and areas outside of the UK?
Yeah, well, the short answer is yes, there absolutely is. I think at the Woodland Trust, we would really advocate for trees that are UK and Ireland sourced and grown wherever possible. So that's trees that have been sourced. They don't necessarily have to be native, but if they've been sourced, grown, and then planted within the UK, that reduces the risk of tree plants and diseases, tree pests and diseases. And just, for example, the 16 new tree pests and diseases arrived in the UK since 2000. So it is a big threat. I'm sure we all know about the threat to ash trees, for example. We expect to lose about 80% of our ash trees from ash dieback. So yes, it's a big threat. Ideally, UK and Ireland sourced and grown. That's the sort of standard that the Woodland Trust would advocate for. I know the UK government has their own scheme called Plant Healthy, which I admit I'm not an expert on. I have another colleague who specialises in plant health, but it is a challenge for nurseries that there aren't many nurseries that exclusively produce UK and Ireland sourced and grown trees. But I suppose the more demand there is, the more that they will do it. So even just asking the question of nurseries when you're sourcing trees will let them know that there is that demand, and they can start to maybe focus on that a bit more, I think.
Okay, thank you. All right, question coming in the live chat from Ian Taylor. It's a question to Abby. It's a practical question about harvesting. So how are you, Abby, able to harvest 2 metre and 6 metre strips of woody type crops?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because the answer is I don't massively know. I'm a farmer. The guy that I work with is a forester. So part of his remit is to come up with those answers. We need to look at this in a slightly different way. You're not simply going to be able to rock into a field with a mower and mow it as we do as farmers. This is forestry operations, and it will require forestry skills and knowledge to be able to do it. This is going to be a job creation for someone to go in and manage that site. Some of those trees will be harvested so that the strips that are 2 meters, there'll be 2 meters of willow, 2 meters of aspen, so 2 meters of lime, etc. So those strips are actually one large area in themselves. A lot of that is going to be manual thinning with a chainsaw. Does that sound horrendous? Yes, it does. But again, you need to think about the value that's going to be coming off it. It will be higher. We're not talking about value of tons of wheat per hectare or whatever it may be. This is a tree. It's entirely different. It's going to do different things. When we harvest that timber, we'll be turning it into biochar. That will do a number of things. One, we'll get heat from it. We are going to put up 2 small polytunnels, and they're only small. They'd only be about 10 to 12 meters long and about 8 meters wide. And we're going to start putting veg in there. Again, job creation. I don't really have much interest in veg myself, but that doesn't mean that there isn't somebody out there who's going to want to come in and do it. And Will has proved that himself with his family. There are opportunities there to do that. So we've got the heat. Then we've got the biochar. The biochar can go into various products such as building materials, no peat compost, etc. These are high value goods. And then the harvesting of the cider, which is slightly different. So it's a bit like a cross between a tree sapling and a maize plant, slightly softer. We may be able to mow that and mow it with something similar to like a finger bar cutter, something like that going through. It's going to be a lot softer. We might even be able to put a small, some sort of small type forager through it. We'll have to see what happens. In all honesty, I don't know, and I actually find that quite exciting. And it may be that we get to the end of it and we think, my goodness, if we were going to offer a blueprint to somebody else, they need to do something completely different. But the idea of having rows of trees and then this cider and then more trees, cider, trees, etc., is you get the biodiversity as well. And the biodiversity is there to help nourish the ground. So this is going to be, we're talking about perennial crops now, not annual. Once you've established it once, we've had questions about establishment. It's actually quite labor intensive to establish trees. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. And I've really struggled with that. And it's quite expensive to establish trees. But once they are in the ground, they're there and that's it for the next 8, 10, 12 years, maybe more. And you're going to use that biodiversity around you. So there's extra trees to make sure that that ground is nourished. You haven't got to go on there anymore other than to harvest. So it will be a very intense period of harvest. and then off from there. So hope that will partially answer your question.
Will, if I may, I think Abby raises a really, really important thing, actually, because actually what she's described is about stacking enterprises. And actually, you could say as farmers, I'm a tree virgin. I didn't know much about trees. Farmers have a sort of arborphobia, and foresters have an agriphobia. We don't necessarily know each other's disciplines. And I think there's a really good opportunity for doing exactly what Abby's talking about, which is actually not only stacking enterprises, but stacking professions together. I would love someone to come and manage the trees on my behalf on the farm. And maybe we need to think about, in this brave new world, about layering people and their skills and their enterprises on our land base. And it is challenging. It's challenging with land agents, with tenancies, with government policy, but it is doable. And I think that then gives us those, if we want multifunctional outputs and that resilience for climate change, we need to think about how we layer enterprises, income streams, and also people and their skills together on our land base.
Yeah. Okay. Well, as a follow-up question to that, then what you've just talked about there, really, I think this is quite a good question. Nigel Hester's asked this. Stephen mentioned planting 4,500 fruit trees. Is the labour cost required to plant, prune, harvest these economic, and what? And could you tell us a bit about the market that you have for the fruit as well, please?
Okay. Planting was fairly straightforward. I got a professional planter to come in and set everything up properly, and we helped with that. And we did everything, 4,500 trees in about 3 weeks with the right equipment. So planting isn't too difficult. The ongoing pruning to date for 10 years we've done by hand, and that's been okay. We've just moved over to mechanical pruning, which is basically a hedge cutter with 4 sort of circular saw blades on it, and we do that in the winter, or in the autumn, and that's usually on sort of stubble post harvest before we go into harvest the fruit and go back and do a pruning. Picking wise, we have done it all by hand, and we can get the labour, but it's now increasingly quite expensive. So we are thinking about how we might be able to mechanise that in terms of tree shaking and harvesting. All our fruit initially went to as wholesale. We've developed our market now, and we now sell some of it as fresh fruit through our retail business, through the farm shop we developed, but the majority goes into juice. And once it's in a bottle, we can add value, and it's good. It's good on the shelf for a year. So we've got a nice sort of cycle going. So we're trying to capture the value as much as we can.
Fantastic, thank you. Question for Emily, and it's a question. I really apologise if I mispronounce your name. Olatan Agbamiji has asked, how can, and this goes back to a little bit I talked about me sitting outside drinking my cup of tea, listening to the bird song, but how can climate change directly affect farm birds?
Yes, it's a good question. I think there's many ways in which climate change can and is affecting farm birds. Obviously, change in temperature is changing habitats. You find a lot of birds, especially those that are more specialist, that rely on specific habitats or specific climates, are being pushed further north. It also affects sort of what those that migrate find that their habitats are disappearing. Or I think one of the big things that we know about from the Woodland Trust is this, I can't remember the term we use now, but basically, for example, if things fall out of sync, so where you have trees flowering before and the caterpillars feeding on those trees before the blue tit chicks have hatched, for example, they miss that window to eat the caterpillars. So I don't think I explained that very well, but basically that you get that mismatch. So you've got all the caterpillars at one time and all the bird chicks wanting to eat the caterpillars at a different time, whereas previously they would have synced up. So that's one way. I think what's important to think about is also just the impact on biodiversity from habitat loss. So we know that over the last 70 years, changes in the way people have farmed have led to a huge loss of habitat. So you mentioned hedgerows yourself, Will, which has had that's probably had one of the biggest impacts on farmland birds. And Stephen talked about the number of birds on his farm. I think there is evidence there's not as much as we would like yet. There's definitely more research needed, but just intuitively, if you add those trees back into farms, birds rely on trees for nesting, for feeding, for sort of communication. You're going to get more birds, not just birds, invertebrates. There is increasing evidence of the importance of trees on farms for pollinators. So I think, climate change is going to have an impact, and there's not much we can do. Obviously, there are ways that we can try and make farming more net zero. There's contributions that farmers can definitely make to helping to reach net zero. But agroforestry can also just help by providing that habitat for not just birds, but other species as well.
Yeah, fantastic. I discovered a brilliant app the other day, by the way. If anyone's interested, it's called Merlin Bird ID. You can just hold it up and it'll tell you exactly what bird's singing. I love it. I'm obsessed with it at the moment. So yeah, if anyone wants to download that. So a practical arable farming question. I'm interested in this, Stephen. And it's a question from Robin Bickley. How do you manage the risk of ag chem drift onto fruit trees from AIs not approved for fruit crops? I guess you could say I'm not spraying on a windy day, but I'm sure you've got a better answer than that. Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Stephen. Yeah. Have you got it? Lost the sound, I think. We'll ask another question while we're waiting then. Stephen has got sound issues, I think. So we
Can I just jump quickly? Sorry.
Go on, sure.
I spotted a question which I think I can answer quite quickly from William McInnes, just asking, sorry, what is SFI? And so apologies for that. I should have explained. So SFI is the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which is the sort of entry-level tier to the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is what will replace the Common Agricultural Policy in England. It
is. Okay. So a question from Peter Daly, and I'm going to guess that Stephen's back with us now, but I'll ask it to all. Any of you know the answer to this can jump in. I've never heard of it before, but what do the panel think of the Miyawaki method of planting trees very close together and its potential for agroforestry? Does anyone know about the Miyawaki method?
Right, so I can come in on this. No, never heard of it before. The forester I work with, who's also a land economist, his theory is that you should pack these trees in as tight as you can for agroforestry, certainly for harvesting the biomass. We're putting, what have we put? We put 4,000 trees on half a hectare. We've really squeezed them in. And the idea is they grow up straight, tall, grow really quickly, and then you chop them down. You chop them down, you lock that biomass, that above ground biomass, into some sort of product, which is probably biochar, because it will lock in about 40 to 60% of that carbon, rather than re-losing it to the atmosphere. And obviously it's leaving that root structure underground then to hold the carbon, and then they start growing all over again. So yeah, pack them in is what I appear to be told. So I'll go with it.
I think if I can jump in on that. So I have heard of the Miyawaki method. It's also known as tiny forests. And it's this idea, it's more of an idea for urban areas that you plant really dense areas of very small forest, and they grow very quickly. Apparently they grow quicker because there's more competition between the trees. So they all grow really quickly to try and outcompete the others. And it's a way of getting sort of woodland and increasing biodiversity in very small areas. And I did, a couple of years ago, I did ask a colleague at the Woodland Trust about this and what we thought about it. And I think the answer was the evidence isn't very conclusive. It does seem to be true that they grow faster. Obviously, they are denser because you pack them in very densely. The suggestion was that it's not, you couldn't upscale it to larger areas just because the cost of planting trees that densely would be quite high. And some of the benefits are overstated, so it's probably better suited to urban areas where you're planting in small spaces. But yes, there can be benefits to it in the right place.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. So, question for Abby. It's a question from David Cuttress. I think this is an interesting question, something that we perhaps haven't touched much upon. But he said that the panel generally seemed to be advocating silvo-arable rather than active silvopastoral approaches. And is there much insight into active grazing of livestock in agroforestry systems with regard to feasibility in the UK? I mean, is this something that you've thought about, Abby? Do you know, can you see your cows grazing between lines of trees in future, perhaps?
Yeah, so my initial thoughts of this as a farmer, and the first line of reaction is, oh my goodness, that is the last thing you could possibly want. Wandering around amongst trees, knocking them flat, or you're trying to round them up and you've got to go in and up trees, or you want to spin fertilizer on that field, or you want to run a slurry pipe across it. What a nightmare. On the other hand, the benefits of shade, and I tell you what, after last summer, shade is going to be absolutely crucial. As somebody who grazes my cows through the summer, because my sheds are not set up for them to be in there in the summertime, I am going to have to think a lot more seriously about shade. Also, there is increasing evidence to prove that where you have got trees in the fields and you've got that root structure set up, as long as you do it right, and we are going to have to get a lot more research into this, into how you plant, where you plant, etc. As long as you can do it right, it can bring huge benefits to holding water in the soil. And there's all sorts of other things you can do as well. And I guess there's a lot of research out there, and we don't see it enough. It's not coming up in our sort of conversations as farmers enough. And I think this is it's not just an opportunity. This is a serious point now that as farmers, we really need to think a little bit more about it. Forget about whether we like trees or we hate trees, or they attract flies, or they might create bunching of cows and mastitis, or sheep are getting caught. Forget that. What are the benefits? Focus on that and do a couple of trials and see if it works. I don't think we can afford to ignore it now.
Yeah, I agree. All right, then we're getting towards time. But Stephen, are you back on the call now? I can't see you on my screen. I'm assuming the rain storm in Cambridge has knocked his broadband out. But I'll ask Emily this instead then. How can we work together to test and expand knowledge around this? A question from Charlie Lamarchin, by the way. How can we work together to test and expand knowledge around agroforestry on UK farms? Currently, much field scale knowledge comes from Europe, and it seems we need either funding which supports experimentation or a collaboration approach to sharing experience.
Well, I think we probably need both of those things, really. And it's true, I think a lot of the research does come from Europe at the moment. The Soil Association estimates that currently agroforestry covers approximately 3% of UK farmland. So it's not a big sort of approach to farming at the moment. But now that the government for England is sort of backing agroforestry, and they're developing grants to support it, we would expect to see that increase. And with that, you sort of increase the experience and the knowledge that we have. But certainly, and we've talked a bit about farmers not really liking trees, not having a lot of experience with trees. And I think one of the things that puts them off is that farmers, traditionally, there is this separation between farmers and foresters, and a lot of farmers don't really know what to do with trees. So there needs to be that knowledge sharing between farmers like Stephen, who have done a lot of this. And I think we really need the government, when they're designing these schemes, to look at ways where they can facilitate that knowledge sharing to help farmers who want to get into this but don't really know what to do. And we do need more research. I feel like this is maybe just a good opportunity, and I can see that Stephen's back, so I'll pass back on to him in a minute, but I feel it's a good opportunity for me to just mention the agroforestry show, which Farmers Weekly is sponsoring, and the Woodland Trust is organising jointly with the Soil Association. That's going to be the 6th to 7th of September at Eastbrook Farm later this year. So yeah, if you're interested in attending, please do go online and book a place.
Thank you, Stephen. Welcome back. Did you hear that question?
I got halfway through the question about spray drift, I think, but I lost connection. BT Gremlins, I guess.
Right. Okay. Well, do you want to, just before we finish, then, do you want to just answer that question about spray drift? Because I think it's quite an interesting question.
Yeah. So obviously, if you've got trees and you've got crops in the field, you've obviously got to be careful with your selection of products. And when you use them, just like you would any other sort of farming practice, the one thing that I guess surprised me a little bit is that with trees in the landscape, you actually reduce wind speed significantly. That's why we went about it. So it means you can spray on days where you wouldn't be able to spray in open fields because the wind speeds are significantly reduced. And it's the one thing I saw around the world is that people were spraying, herbicides, fungicides, whatever, in an agroforestry context where they wouldn't be able to do that. So in open fields, you get more spray days. So actually, it's not as big as an issue as you think. And actually, just to capitalise on what Emily said about the agroforestry show, the other thing that people might be interested in is there's a big new 7-year European project called Climate Smart Demo and Climate Farm Demo, which is recently just kicked off, and we've set up as a living lab farm. So there's going to be a big network of agroforestry farms that come out of that. So people that are interested will be able to engage with that. And 20th and 21st of May, so next month, there is a national agroforestry weekend where those about 30 farms that are doing agroforestry are throwing their doors open so people can come and have a look. And if people are interested in that, just Google agroforestry open weekend.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay. Well, we've got loads more questions, and I'm sorry that we haven't been able to get to them all, but do send them in, and I'm sure that because we'll try to answer them. The video will be available very soon if you've registered, so that'll be winging its way to your inbox, I'm sure. Thank you again to the Woodland Trust. Please do look up, if you're thinking about it, look up the Woodland Trust More Woods and More Hedges schemes funded by Lloyds Bank. They're really, really easy to access, as I said. There's one thing I would sort of take away from tonight very briefly is that, working together on this, keeping an open mind, if you do that, you can help the environment, make your business more diverse and resilient. And whilst I understand as a practical farmer, this is a big change, and a lot of people will have a lot of questions. I think there's a lot of opportunities here, and I think that's really, really exciting. So thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. Thank you for sending in your questions, and we'll see you all soon. Good night.